Migration, asylum and deportation. From Australia to Europe and on to the United States. It's a global issue. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Migrants continue to seek asylum in the United States by crossing the border between Mexico and the US, while the Trump administration fights back. Hundreds more undocumented immigrants are being rounded up by US law enforcement and processed for deportation. But the US is not the only country dealing with these issues. In 2015 and 2016, a wave of migrants and refugees sought asylum in Europe as they fled wars in Syria and Iraq. Thousands more have died or have been rescued at sea as they tried to reach Europe from Africa. And Italy is taking a tough stance on migrants by closing reception centres and trying to prevent rescue boats from docking at Italian ports. Meanwhile, Australia has long had some of the toughest asylum policies in the world as it tries to prevent migrants and refugees from entering. To discuss all of this, joining me now from Sydney is Daniel Ghezelbash. He is a senior lecturer at Macquarie Law School, and he's the author of Refuge Lost, Asylum Law in an Interdependent World. Joining me here in the studio is Paulina Vera. She is a lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. With us from Oxford is Reuven Ziegler. He's an associate professor in international refugee law at the University of Reading. And with us here too in the studio is Matthew O'Brien. He is director of research at the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Welcome to all of you to the studio. Daniel, let me start with you and let's look at Australia's policies. Australia has adopted, of course, a very tough asylum policy. That policy has been in effect for many years. In fact, it's at sea. It's been blocking refugees from coming to Australia. It's been locking them up in detention centres on islands which are situated off Papua New Guinea as well as off Nauru. What's behind the tough Australian policy? And at their worst, what were conditions like on those islands?
So yeah, as you said, for many years now, we've been, starting from 2012 and 2013, we've been pushing back boats, and we've pretty much completely blocked access to the Australian territory for refugees and asylum seekers coming by boat. And Australia has a particular, I guess we're unique in that we're an island nation, so complete control is within reach, and having that possibility has kind of made it a bit of a fetish for governments to pursue. And because it is within reach, we've introduced this series of policies here. In terms of the conditions on Nauru and Manus, I think it's fair to say they are very, very bad. MSF was recently kicked out of Nauru after carrying out some mental health clinics on the island, and they reported that the levels of mental health problems on the island were worse than in war zones that they've been working in, particularly with PTSD. And really, the policy is designed to create a sense of hopelessness for the men and women waiting on Nauru and Manus Island. That's really taken its toll over many years.
All right, let me bring in Reuven Ziegler. He's in Oxford. And Reuven, Europe, of course, has been dealing with a major influx of people seeking asylum, with refugees as well, many of them coming from Syria, from Iraq, as well as from Africa. Now we have a right-wing government in Italy, which is cracking down hard on people seeking asylum in Italy and refugees who are arriving in Italy. What can you tell us about the very hardline position that the Italians are taking?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the European Union as such has very high protection standards under EU law and under international law. But the challenge that the last few years has really brought to bear is the challenge of having access to protection, of actually reaching a European Union country in order to make a claim, make a potentially successful claim for international protection. And Italy has been now in the forefront of attempts to try and subvert what is the structure of protection under EU law by firstly trying to prevent boats from reaching Italian shores, boats that have rescued migrants in international waters and wish to dock in Italian ports in order for the people on those boats to make a claim for asylum. And we have two boats at the moment in the Mediterranean, the Ocean Viking, run by Médecins Sans Frontières, and Open Arms, which is a Spanish ship As you mentioned, under the current Italian government, recent legislation just passed a couple of weeks ago slaps incredibly high fines on NGOs if they do what effectively governments are supposed to do, which is to operate in order to rescue persons who seek asylum.
Ruby, just on the point of what Italy is doing, as you point out, Italy is trying to subvert European Union law on refugees, on people who are seeking asylum. So in a sense, is Italy actually violating EU law?
Well, I think there's a strong argument that it is. I mean, it's violating international refugee law, and by implication, being part of EU law, it's also subverting and violating EU law. But there's another dimension to this, which is part of the background story for why Italy is doing what it's doing. And that is that under EU law, the primary responsibility for handling an asylum claim, in most cases, lies with the country that the asylum seeker has first reached within the European Union. And those tend to be, obviously, countries in the Mediterranean, so Spain, Italy, Greece, all countries on the eastern front of Europe. And Italy essentially is saying, if we can't have responsibility sharing in a better way within Europe, we're just not going to have it. Now, rather than try to act towards reforming the European asylum system, they are essentially trying to breach EU law to get that action going.
All right, let me bring it here to the studio to Paulina. Paulina, here in the United States, of course, we know that thousands of migrants have been detained at the southern border. Children have been separated from their parents. We see these ICE deportation raids taking place in the state of Mississippi. What is your assessment of the Trump administration's policy on migrants and those seeking asylum?
Well, it's no secret that the Trump administration has been trying to curb migration from the southern border. They often conflate asylum law with illegal immigration, although that is not the case. It is perfectly legal to come to the United States and express a fear of returning to your home country and apply for asylum. But some of the ways in which they've been trying to curb the migration coming from the southern border include in the interior by instituting something called rocket dockets, where they're putting pressure for these cases to go through the immigration courts quickly. They're putting quotas on immigration judges that are tied to their promotions and raises in the future. So pressuring also the immigration judges to make quicker decisions on the cases as well. Then we see at the border, like you mentioned, family separation, detention of children, detention in what are called hieleras or ice boxes, or perreras, which are known as dog kennels, horrific conditions. And then now we're even seeing the administration trying to stem migration coming from Central America by strong-arming Guatemala into signing an agreement in which people that pass through Guatemala are supposed to apply for asylum there first. And if they come to the United States border and have passed through the country, then they're actually ineligible to apply here in the United States, which would obviously primarily affect migrants coming from the other Northern Triangle countries, including El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras.
Right, and that rule that you were talking about, that's called the third country deal.
It's called the Safe Third Country Agreement. So pursuant to international law standards that have been adopted into our domestic legislation, in the Immigration and Nationality Act, it actually describes an exception for people applying for asylum here in the United States by saying that if the Attorney General determines per a multilateral or bilateral agreement that a person could be returned to a country where their freedom or liberty wouldn't be threatened by what we call the 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, and that country has a fair procedure in place to make an asylum determination, then those individuals can be sent back to that country. But currently the United States only has one agreement in place, and that's with Canada. That was signed in 2002, that went into effect in 2004. Obviously, the situation at the northern border is much different than the situation that we have currently at the southern border.
Matthew, what do you make of what's going on at the southern border and what Paulina has just told us here of the use of these rocket dockets, of judges being strong-armed, immigration court judges being strong-armed into making decisions very quickly, tying those decisions to their prospects for promotion as well?
Well, I think a lot of that is hysteria. I spent many years as a private bar immigration attorney representing people seeking asylum. I also worked for many years as an attorney with ICE, representing the government in deportation proceedings. What's described as the rocket docket is just good judicial management techniques. Courts are expected to produce results. That's why we have them. And if there are things going on that inhibit those, the government is entitled to address those just as it would any other governmental process. And I think the existence of the Safe Country Agreement with Canada illustrates that this isn't motivated by any malign type of desire to prohibit people from certain parts of the world from coming into the U.S. I think it's just a good procedure. It's not any different than what the EU has done with the Dublin regulation.
But Matthew, is it really hysteria? Because we've seen pictures on television of children being separated from their parents at the border. We've seen pictures of people being held in very crowded conditions in detention centers at the southern border. Is that hysteria?
It is. Most of those pictures are showing people in transitional centers, which are called service processing centers, that are maintained by Customs and Border Protection. They're rated for holding people for a maximum of 72 hours before they're transferred to longer-term facilities. And I think, as far as the rest of this goes, the pictures of the children, a lot of those were traced to the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. And those pictures don't tell the whole story. Those are usually children being placed in a controlled environment so that they don't become victimized by other people who are around them. It's also important to note that if you're arrested in the United States as a U.S. citizen, for instance, right outside the studio, you're pulled over for drunk driving or some other relatively innocuous crime, and you have children in the car, you're going to be separated from them.
Paulina, is it hysteria? And those pictures that we saw of children, we did see pretty strong evidence of children being held under the Trump administration and being denied basic facilities like soap and toothpaste. There's been a lot written about that.
So it is not hysteria. I envy Mr. O'Brien, actually, because it must be nice to have the privilege to look at these issues from the 30,000-foot viewpoint. However, every single day I talk to asylum seekers that have recently have come from the border and been held in these detention facilities, and they do tell me that there's overcrowding, that they are given water that tastes like chlorine, that they are given space blankets, and that the AC is kept so high that they're constantly cold and shivering. So these are stories that I hear all the time from my clients. And like Mr. O'Brien said, there are regulations in place that these individuals are supposed to only be held for a X number of hours, but there's plenty of evidence that they actually are held beyond the 72 hours that's required in direct violation of the law. Actually, when I was in law school, I worked on a lawsuit against the Tucson sector CBP, where of actually my hometown, Tucson, Arizona, where we explore these conditions. So it is correct that this also happened under the Obama administration, but I would say it's exponentially grown under the Trump administration.
All right, let me go back to Daniel and continue looking at the situation in Australia. Daniel, if deterrence was the goal of the Australian government in imposing these very harsh conditions on people seeking asylum in the country, has it succeeded?
Look, the policies have been successful in effectively blocking access to asylum in Australia. So given that we're an island nation, you only get here by boat, and given that we intercept the boats and push them back before they get here, then deterrence has been successful, but it has come at a very high cost, and both a human cost in terms of the impact it's had on the individuals that have been subject to the policy. So you have, as I already said, endemic mental health issues within the communities on Nauru and Manus Island. We don't know what happens to the people that get pushed back at sea because there's no way of following them up, but it's very likely that they could be returned to places where they face persecution. And it also comes at an incredibly high fiscal cost. So we spend about $4 billion a year on border protection. We're not talking about large-scale arrivals ever coming to Australia. So the peak in 2013 was 20,000 people claiming asylum here. So we're spending what amounts to $4 billion a year to try and keep 20,000 people away, when the entire UNHCR budget for a mandate of more than 20 million refugees is around $8 billion. And it's also had, I think, a significant impact on our international reputation. So it's difficult for us to hold ourselves out as a good global citizen when we are treating refugees and asylum seekers this way. And it takes away our moral authority and high ground to be able to criticize other countries for human rights violations. And that's quite concerning.
Ruvi, let's look at one European country which has taken a very different approach to dealing with asylum seekers and refugees, and that's Germany. There was a big surge of migrants to Germany, mainly from Syria in 2016. How has Germany dealt with the issue of asylum, and the people who arrived in the country, how have they been integrated into German society?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Of course, Germany with just over 1 million refugees, according to last year's data, is the only country of the global north countries that is in the top 10 refugee hosting countries in the world. And it's primarily due to that surge in 2015-16, where Germany has basically said, we understand that the Dublin system within the European Union is a counter-responsibility sharing system. It's one that forces the countries that receive asylum seekers to have to share all of the responsibility. And so we are going to actually assume responsibility for a larger share. And that's the reason why Syrians primarily, but also people from Iraq, from Afghanistan, have arrived in Germany. Now, because Germany follows quite strictly European Union law, which has not just refugee status, but also subsidiary protection for those who face real risk of serious harm for torture, inhuman or degrading treatment, or the death penalty, or violence in conflict. The consequence is that the majority of those who arrive from, say, Syria, have received one or the other form of protection. The other thing Germany has done is it's operated a very robust system of dispersal within Germany, so that not all asylum seekers end up in one German state, but rather they'll be spread more equitably based on GDP, on unemployment, and on other capacities of the German states. Now, the challenges that Germany currently faces relate to, obviously, a degree of backlash that policy has generated, primarily with Alternative für Deutschland, which is a right-wing anti-European and anti-immigration party that is doing better than it used to in German polls. And the other is the challenges in removing from Germany those who have failed to seek asylum successfully and are still in the country. And so those are steps that Germany is now taking. But overall, I think it's fair to say Germany's approach has been both exemplary and quite successful.
Right. Matthew, I want to get back to something that Daniel said when he said that Australia's reputation has taken a bit of a battering because of its policy towards asylum seekers. If we look at the situation here on the southern border of the United States, with children separated from their parents, people being locked up, you can throw the law book at them, sure. But what about other things, more intangible things like human compassion, the moral issue that raises?
Well, I'm not sure that there is a moral issue in this particular circumstance. These are individuals who in the main are fleeing what are called generalized conditions of civil strife. They don't actually qualify under the 5 protected grounds that were mentioned earlier. So there's a question as to whether they're legitimately accessing the asylum system or not. But I think more importantly than that, the US has one of the most robust asylum and refugee systems of any country in the world. And since asylum and refugee status existed with independent nation states, the United States has taken in more refugees and asylees than all the other countries in the world combined. So I think with this particular situation, the question is, what is going on south of the border and why are people fleeing? And if that's the case, is there something that we can do to help correct that problem in the country where people have grown up into which they have attachments? Because there are downsides to this. Generally speaking, the people who flee in these situations are men between the ages of 18 and 45. They're the individuals who would drive social change in their own countries. And when they come here, what happens is they wind up earning money, they send money back home to support their families, and very frequently that money is taxed by the regimes that are causing problems, and it allows those regimes to extend their life over time when they would not necessarily have been able to do that if you didn't have this cycle of migration and remittance.
What do you make of that, Paulina, that many of the people arriving at the southern border don't actually qualify under current law in the United States?
I think that that is absolutely not true. I definitely think that the Trump administration is trying to narrow the category of people that qualify for asylum by issuing precedent decisions. Former Attorney General Jeff Sessions issued a decision taking issue with one formulation of a particular social group that would encompass asylum seekers seeking asylum on the basis of domestic violence. The current Attorney General just issued a precedent decision taking issue with family-based groups being eligible for asylum. So I think that they're trying to narrow the amount of people specifically coming from the Northern Triangle countries that are eligible for asylum. However, we still have good existing case law that says otherwise, that these people are in fact able to obtain asylum here in the United States.
And Matthew, just looking at the categories in which people can qualify for asylum in the United States, people in Central America are running away, are fleeing extreme violence, gang violence in those countries. They are fleeing for their lives, literally. Why doesn't that qualify as a reason for the United States to accept them?
Asylum and refugee status are both designed to protect people from persecution, and persecution has a very specific definition under the law. Yeah. It's behavior that is targeted at any one of the protected groups in order to oppress them and prohibit their participation in the political system and in the country of the, in the overall life of the country where they're living. So if you are going to qualify for asylum on the basis of a criminal activity, the law says that criminal activity has to be committed by parties that the government is either unable or unwilling to control. And in these situations...
Well, clearly they are unable to control it in these countries.
Well, I don't think that's the case. The homicide rates in a lot of these countries now are lower than they are in Baltimore, which is 45 minutes away from where we're sitting now. So generally speaking, being the victim of criminal behavior is not something that makes one eligible for political asylum. And if you are going to rely on that basis, then you have a higher legal showing to make in order to establish that this is something that the government is unable or unwilling to control.
Okay, Paulina, you guys are the lawyers.
Right.
From a legal basis, does that hold water?
No, it does not. So people are actually able to show that their government is unable or unwilling to control private actors that persecute them. For example, I have several clients who actually were former police officers and were told by their superiors, you know what, the gang is targeting you, you know what happens when gangs target you. You might as well flee the country. Right. So even their own government officials know that they do not have the tools necessary. They may be willing, certainly. I think that they also want to combat gang activity as well, but they certainly do not have the tools necessary to make sure that that happens.
Yeah. That doesn't mean that they meet the legal standard, however. That's a different question. So you're talking about a legal standard, and the fact that you believe someone should qualify for asylum doesn't necessarily mean that they do qualify for asylum.
Would decide,
and so I actually was not finished speaking.
Go ahead.
So in order to qualify for asylum, you have to show that you've been persecuted, whether by your government or by a private actor, for a characteristic that you either cannot change or you're not required to change. So for example, being a woman in a domestic violence situation, being a member of the family. I see a lot of times mothers who are trying to protect their children from being recruited into the gangs or to become gang girlfriends. That is a relationship, a familiar relationship that they cannot change. And the Immigration and Nationality Act, as well as our robust immigration case law, does allow for those things.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Daniel. Daniel, it seems that the Australian government is concerned about its reputation, is worried over the extensive reporting that we've seen on conditions at these detention camps. In fact, there was a series of articles that was published in the New York Times on conditions in those camps back in 2016. In 2015, the government in Australia passed what is known as the Australian Border Force Act, which made it a criminal offence for whistleblowers to reveal anything about conditions in those camps. What was the Australian government trying to hide?
So, so this is, I guess, a very common tactic in terms of the entire Australian approach, which is to try and shroud everything as much secrecy as possible. And if you, all the policies we're talking about, firstly, there's rarely ever an attempt to articulate a sort of legal argument under international law defending them. There's very rarely clear indication of actually what's going on. So we have very clear a policy of not commenting on anything that happens out at sea. So we literally don't know where or how boats are being intercepted and boats are being pushed back. And they tried to extend that secrecy to the camps with that act that you mentioned, which made it an offence for whistleblowers. But thankfully, they backpedaled on that, and there was an exception brought in for doctors shortly out thereafter. But the whistleblowing laws still do apply to everyone else that's a government contractor on Nauru and Manus Island.
Ruby, looking at the situation in Europe, what are the political implications? I mean, we've seen in many countries in Europe that there are parties on the right, some of them on the very far right, who've had successes at the ballot box. To what extent is this being driven by the asylum issue, by people seeking refugee status in Europe?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that Europe is a divided place, right? Much like I suspect on your side of the pond. The last European elections have seen a very significant rise for the Green parties across Europe and for Liberal parties, both of which are very supportive of both a more robust European approach to protection and of asylum generally. And it's also seen, as you said, a rise in populist right-wing parties, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, but also, as I've said earlier, in Germany. What I would say is that part of the political problem in the European Union is precisely this indecision around asylum. So it is pretty clear that the current Dublin system of allocation of responsibility isn't functioning well. It is creating animosity in Mediterranean countries like Italy. Yep. It's not equitable in terms of its responsibility sharing. But the problem is that in order to fix that, you need more Europe, not less Europe. You actually need a permanent system for relocation of asylum seekers within Europe on equitable bases, like the European Commission has proposed and the European Parliament approved. And you need to introduce humanitarian visas so that people don't have to cross the Mediterranean in a dangerous journey, but can just board a plane or boat in a regular fashion. And to get those through, of course, you need to counter the narrative that one hears from Salvini or from Orban or from the Alternative für Deutschland, or indeed in my country from Nigel Farage. And the migration issue has been at the heart of Europe's challenges in the last few years, and we're not out of the docks yet.
And time has caught up with us. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. We're going to have a leave it there. You've been watching The Heat. Thanks for watching.